Hi everyone. In the last video, we used equations to graph trigonometric functions. In this video, we're going to go in the other direction. We're going to start with a graph and come up with the equation. So let's start out with this graph here. You'll notice that the graph starts at a high point, and then we have a full cycle is in the tulip shape. So what that tells us is that the base function for this graph is cosine. And also notice that it hasn't shifted to the right or left because the normal cosine graph also starts at a high point along the y-axis. We haven't changed the period because a single cycle takes 2 pi. So normally we could have all of these different variables, a cosine bx minus c plus d, as we mentioned before in the last video, where this a is amplitude, the b relates to the period, so 2 pi over b equals the period. The c was the horizontal translation, and the d was the vertical translation. So if you look at this graph, the high point is at 3, and the low point is at -1. So our graph sort of fits between 3 and -1. It's not symmetric across the axis. So in this case, we know we have a vertical, and we could possibly have a change in amplitude. So we're trying to find this equation, a cosine x plus d. We don't need to find b or c because we haven't changed the period, nor have we translated left or right. So to find a is the amplitude of the graph. And remember that the amplitude is the difference between the highest point, the highest value, the lowest value, and then divide that by 2. So the amplitude is going to be 3, which is our highest value, minus -1, which is our lowest value, divided by 2. And that's 4 over 2, which equals 2. So the amplitude here is 2. Now to find our shift up, we basically just look for the center line of the graph. So halfway in between the highest and lowest point, that's going to occur at 1, at y equals 1. Usually the center line is at 0. So if I started with a center line at 0, now it's at 1, that means I shifted up by 1. So d equals 1 because center line shifted up from 0 to 1. So that means our final equation, let's use a different color here, is f of x equals 2 cosine x plus 1. Okay, so let's try another example. Here we are. This one, our base function is going to be sine because the graph starts at 0, 0. And one thing we notice right off the bat is that the center line is still here. So we haven't shifted up or down. So in this case, there's no d. So we need to find the amplitude, b, how related to the period, and c, any left or right shifts. But notice that the normal sine function also starts at 0, 0. So we can very quickly see that c equals 0 because there's no shift left or right. The next easiest one to find is the amplitude. So to find a, we look at the difference between the highest y value and the lowest y value and divide that by 2. So that's going to be 3 minus negative 3 divided by 2, which is 6 over 2, which equals 3. We could also see that because this is centered at 0, 0, so we can just look at the height of a wave, which is 3. So that's our A. Now to find the period, that one's a little bit trickier, or not to find the period, but to find the B. So remember how B was related to the period. So we know that 2 pi over B equals the period of our graph. So let's find the period in this graph. Remember, the period is just the amount of time it takes to complete a full cycle. So if we start here, we start out going down, then we go up, then we come back down and start over. So the period is pi. So 2 pi over B equals pi because the period is pi. And now I just solve for B. So I get 2 pi by cross multiplying equals pi times B, which means that B equals 2. Now there's one small thing that I've forgotten. Remember that the graph of sine starts out going up. Our graph starts out going down. So even though it's true that the amplitude is 3, this A, we need to put a minus sign in front of it because the graph starts out going down, because it's flipped. It's reflected over the axis. Okay, so 3 pieces. Amplitude, well, I guess 4 pieces. Amplitude, the height of a wave. Negate it because we've flipped the normal graph. Change the period because instead of completing one cycle over the course of 2 pi, we complete 2 cycles over the course of 2 pi. So B is 2. And notice if there are any shifts left, right, up, or down. In this case, there weren't any, so both C and D were 0. So our final equation for this graph is f of x equals minus 3 sine 2x minus 0 plus 0. So just minus 3 sine 2x. So I hope that these examples are helpful and informative. Good luck with the rest of the problems, and let me know if you have any questions.